things we can't control. So we're trying to position ourselves because the world of folklore is so big. It partakes of mythology. It partakes of all countries. We're going to focus on America. Hagiography means the lives of the saints. And hagiography, they tend not to talk about all the ways that various saints were oftentimes quite difficult people. But we're not going to say that. So that blends over to legends. And that blends over to a type of, could you close that door, please? That blends over to a type of literature that is more oral. People tell the stories. They don't bother writing it down. And they tell it artistically. So they frequently lapse into more country, not grammatically precise. They slur their words. They say, I'm drinking rather than I'm drinking. Bah. And they just stretch the truth a little bit because it don't hurt no. And so we're talking about tall tales, BS. You know, there's a kind of allergy to that. I want to comment, as I'm warming up, that part of the problem with tall tales is they've gone out of style because starting around 1960, we have been in an orgy of exposing people who should not be exposed according to the values and the courtesies of 1940, namely political officers, who, if they had a little affair on the side, we just don't talk about that, and all kinds of scandals. Back when I was a kid, if you were white and you were over 40, you were considered honest. That was before the 1960s, when the line was, don't trust anybody over 30. So this kind of flip is something I want to remind you of, because you have been raised in a culture where many people, your parents and your grandparents, and especially your great-grandparents, had a very different cultural background. And what I'm reminding you of is the kind of humor they did when we just sat around and talked. There's still some of that humor going on, where people rather enjoy a good, tall story. If you can lie and lead me along with it and have me half believing you, even a quarter believing you, and it's all in good fun, it don't hurt none. I'm not asking you to vote for people. I'm not asking you to bunch up your pocketbook. I'm just saying, ride along with me a bit. Lying a bit is a bit fun. I'm saying this because kids today don't know that lying is funny. Except, of course, at a folk level, yo mama is so fill in the gap. Skinny, fat, rich, poor. There's a lot of these kind of stories where I was so poor, you were so poor. So lies and folklore is a living part, but it doesn't get talked about much on television. And the key point is, young people today are very immersed in modern media, and we don't have this kind of folklore. So it's reminding you of that. But we used to tell stories about all kinds of people. Paul Bunyan, that's misspelled, B-U-N-Y-A-N. But we had Zorro in our life. We had Davy Crockett in Disneyland. Davy Crockett. We had all these kinds of people, and we had a lot of stories about them. I'll be talking about them. The key point is there are these, and there are songs about these too. So to begin with, I have a fellow in crime, Rowie, who is going to sing with me a little song to entertain you. about tall stories.
Okay. Just practiced on it yesterday. I don't remember the word hard.
I was born about 10,000 years ago. There ain't nothing in this world that I don't know. I saw Peter, Paul, and Moses playing Ring Around the Roses. I'll whoop the guy what says it isn't so.
I'm just a lonesome traveler, a great historical bum. Highly educated, through history I have come. I build a log of ages, a year of one, and that's about the biggest thing that man ever done.
I saw Satan when he looked the garden o'er. I saw Adam and Eve driven from the door, and from behind the bushes peeping, I saw the apple they was eating. I swear I was the guy that ate the core.
Garden of Eden? Well, I built the Garden of Eden, 'twas a year of two. John the apple picker union always paid my dues. I'm the guy that signed the contract to raise the rising sun, and that's about the biggest thing that man ever done.
I taught Samson how to use his mighty hands. I first showed Columbus these happy lands. And for the Pharaoh's little kiddies, I built all the pyramids. And to Sahara carried all the sands.
Pyramids? Ha! Wait. I was straw boss on the pyramid and Tower Babel too. I opened up the ocean, let my grandchildren through. I fought 1,000,000 battles and I never lost one. And that's about the biggest thing that man ever done.
Queen Elizabeth, she fell in love with me. We got married in Milwaukee secretly. But I got tired of her, shook her, went off with General Hooker, fighting skeeters down in Tennessee.
I fought the revolution that set this country free. Me and a couple of Indians, we dumped the Boston Tea. I won the Battle of Valley Forge and the Battle of Bull Run. And that's about the biggest thing that man ever done.
I was born about 10,000 years ago. There ain't nothing in this world that I don't know. I saw Peter, Paul, and Moses playing Ring Around the Roses, and I'll swear I was the guy who stole the dough. We have a new word called truthiness. Truthiness, it means it's good enough. It's true enough. And some of you may even know some of the people who cannot withhold their judgment about whether something is true or false. Never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And that's actually really not true when you're talking about somebody trying to sell you something and you want to get the real dope. So it's a different category. But where it doesn't matter is if you're sitting around the fire and the game is, give me a good story. Tell me the good story. It was this big. Once, I remember a Gary Larson story where it says the two guys were sitting on the front porch of the old cartoonist's home. And one guy says to the other, I once drew a nose that was this big. That's a joke. All right. So we're going to talk about Paul Bunyan in the middle. and Pecos Bill, who used a rattlesnake as a lariat. We're going to talk about Davy Crockett, who rode on alligators, and John Henry, and who else? Oh, this is Slewfoot Sue, which is Pecos Bill's girlfriend, who rode on a big, giant catfish. We're not going to talk about her. But there's a whole bunch of people we're not going to talk about. Nowadays, when I was your age, we had to go 6 miles in the snow barefoot just to get on the internet. And nowadays, kids can get on the internet and they can read about these people. Just type in their name and you'll get a story. I'll be talking about some of these people, and I'll be moving around the United States as I talk about them, from Johnny Appleseed to Pecos Bill, and I'll finish with a song about John Henry. Because people have been writing tall tales, exaggerating them. I don't want to say something sacrilegious, but some of those stories seem to stretch the truth a little bit. And people have been stretching the truth for thousands and thousands of years. We'll talk about Joe Magarac, the steel man from Pittsburgh. Every region has its own categories of heroes, and it's fun to have a hero. Do you know, I'm making one up right now, when the first pioneer in Sun City built a little house out of stones and fought off the rattlesnakes, that kind of stuff, you know. And please exaggerate and build on this story so you can tell your grandchildren and great-grandchildren how you helped pioneer this place. This is the greatest country in the world, and people are real ethnocentric. If I were in Latvia, I'd be telling the story. This is the greatest country in the world, and our people are the greatest, and I'm the greatest. And by the way, liquor, beer, a little lubrication of the mind, and a little bragging was part of the culture 100 years ago. So we sat around and we told stories, and people listened because they didn't have anything else to listen to. Kids today, they're all in this, you know. And they'll say, when I was your age, we used to have to do our thumbs. Now you can just think it. You watch. And the stories are very mixed. They're not all humorous in the real story, because we're talking about the history of our people, the history of our family. But today we'll be emphasizing tall stories and the fact that you can play with almost anything, including your history. The key point being that there is this category of, I'm telling you the truth because I'm selling you insurance or a car. And people don't like to be lied to. Back then, it wasn't as hot of an issue. I'm trying to remind you that this lecture is about a changing world, changing values. And so people are kind of allergic to fibbing and lying. But back then, it was a bit of a game. And Disney has made pictures of it. Well, again, Paul Bunyan, John Henry. This is Johnny Appleseed, Casey Jones. And we hear about these characters. Some of them are more real. Some of them are more fictional. In today's cartoon pages, we don't hear the stories drawn out for a while. So that's where you hear these kind of short, quick, little jokes. When I was your age, in the olden days, you might finish a cartoon strip and not have a punchline. You wanted to get the comic the next day to see what happened. And even then you might not get the punchline. You just got deeper into the story. And that happened in the series, even this television and the movie serials, where the cliffhanger referred to the heroine hanging off of a cliff. What was going to happen to her in the next serial? You went to the movie and you paid your nickel. When I was your age, we paid a nickel. No, great-grandpapa. It pretty quickly got up to a quarter. But nowadays, I've encountered more and more people whose humor is self-deprecating. They did not brag. It is not nice to brag. But in the olden days, yeah, you bragged. And you fought. You fought physically. And even we were kind of coming out of the time when it was okay to fight. But the generation before me, lots of boys fought because literal fighting and then making friends of the people who would give you a good fight was part of the culture. And before that, they fought even more viciously. But again, it was considered to be a mark of masculinity, which was a good thing in the olden days. So they had songs, and I sang a lot of folk songs. A lot of people forget that the 50s was not just rock and roll. As a matter of fact, most of Elvis came in after the 50s. Just a few of them came in at the end. But there was a lot of Latin American songs, and there was a lot of folk songs, and the Kingston Trio. And I learned a lot of them because I was a camp counselor, so I sang kids' songs, and some of these were exaggerated songs too. And Pete Seeger was one of the characters who sang the songs, and he sang that song that I was singing, I'm just a lonesome traveler, a great historical bum. You can look thee up, and all the verses, a lot more than we sang, were presented, and you can find them on the internet. When I was your age, we didn't have an internet and Google. As a matter of fact, even 15 years ago, which is the olden days, we didn't have that. And we bragged, we told stories, we tried to say, you can really trust me. But then we would say something that is totally inconceivable. So that was our way of saying, well, don't really trust me. Just take this with a grain of salt and a twinkle in the eye. So Pete Seeger sang that. And this may be a little bit sacrilegious. That word is correctly spelled. Sacrilegious. I checked it because I thought it was sacrilegious, but it's sacrilegious with an I. Anyway, people have been painting and artistically exempling and turning over what was good and what was bad, what was holy and what was not holy. Even in the Middle Ages, there were days where everything was reversed. Fools were considered to be the priests of the town, so for all practical purposes, during those simple days. And we've made up morals not because they were true, but because they made a good story. Yes, the story of George Washington and the cherry tree is not true. Oh man, I had me going there. I thought that was really true. No, it was told to edify children so that they would tell the truth. We'll start with the Northeast. You know, one of the things that we do, much of the work was really hard work. You needed physical ability. And if you could get somebody who was 6 feet, 7 feet tall, it really added to your work and made it easier. Well, why not have somebody 12, 15, 30 feet tall? Okay with me. Old Stormalong. He was that tall, and his boat was so big it couldn't even get into the harbor. There's a lot of stories about that. And the joy of telling a tall story is to have somebody who was bigger than you. In the ancient Greeks, they were called small g gods. somebody bigger, more powerful, who did all these wonderful things. Johnny Appleseed was a real person. A lot of these people weren't. But Johnny Appleseed was an eccentric who, in the Ohio Territory, would go down the river on a raft, and he would plant little patches, he'd clear and plant little patches of apple trees, which in those days were mainly used for cider. They were so tart that they were not edible. But it was the beginning of an industry, and cider was better than potatoes or wheat. You could make a kind of wine liquor with them. And it was also, you could make pies. You added a lot of sugar or sweetener or honey. But Johnny Appleseed was a funny character, John Chapman, because he really was quite an ascetic, a person who would go without a lot of clothes. And they amplified this. They said he was so kind to animals that if there were mosquitoes biting him, he would, but they were burning themselves to death in the fire, he would put out the fire and let them bite him and freeze, let them bite him. So he was sometimes considered a bit of a weird guy. He would come into the house and they would have to leave the dogs out because people did not have pets in the house. There weren't a lot of dogs and cats in the house in the 19th century. That's a very 20th century kind of thing. I'm going to sing you another little song, still staying in that area of the Ohio Valley in Pennsylvania, which was mainly forested. And the song is Oleana, because land speculators would come along and they'd say, you want to buy some land and join us, it won't cost you that much. And this would go on in Europe. And they would tell exaggerated stories, much like land speculators even today. And people would buy the land, and people ended up telling stories such as Oleana. I want you to sing along with me, and all you have to sing is the chorus, which is Ole, Oleana, Ole, Oleana, Ole, 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 Oleana. Sing it. Ole, Oleana, Ole, Oleana, Ole, 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 Oleana. Oh, to be in Oleana, that's where I would like to be, then be bound in Norway and wear the chains of slavery. Ole, Oleana, Ole, Oleana, Ole, 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 Oleana. In Oleana, land is free. The corn and the wheat just plant themselves, then grow a good 4 feet a day, while on your back you rest yourself. Ole, Oleana, Ole, Oleana, Ole, 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 Oleana. Beer as sweet as Muncheneer springs to the ground and rolls away. Cows all like to milk themselves. The hens lay eggs 10 times a day. Ole, Oleana, Ole, Oleana, Ole, 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 Oleana. Little roasted piggies run around the city streets inquiring so politely if a slice of ham you'd like to eat. Ole, Oleana, Ole, Oleana, Ole, 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 Ole. This was popular during the 1950s, so college students picked it up, and they had one that went like this. Keep going. In Oleana, there's no homework on all your midterm, you get A's. Pretty girls all call you out and ask you out 3 times a day. Ole, Oleana, Ole, Oleana, Ole, 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 Oleana. It was a sexist era, the 19th century. So they would sing this verse. Don't hold me to it. In Oleana, the women there do all the work as round the fields they quickly go, and each one carries a hickory stick, and she beats herself if she works too slow. Holy, holy Anna, holy, holy Anna, holy, 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 holy Anna. So if you'd begin to live to holy Anna, you must go. The poorest wretch in Norway can become a king in a year or so. Holy, holy Anna, holy, holy Anna, holy, 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 holy Anna. Folk songs. You make a song out of it. You make a joke out of it. Another character in that same area was Pittsburgh in the 1870s. And in Pittsburgh, this is a little bit later, was on a big river. There were iron mines, there were coal mines, there was wood. What do you need to make an iron and steel factory? Pittsburgh. And so they had iron works. And they had a giant of a man, because that was hard work. A giant of a man who did not bother getting freaked out by the heat. And his name was Joe Magarac. And he was a character that the people like to talk about because he would protect him. He was their friend. He was the guy who would come through when it was getting too hard. Joe Magarac would have to take care of it. And they told stories about how Joe Magarac would come in and he would bend the steel by himself. He could work, he could get into the hot steel and not melt. That's pretty good. Joe Magarac. Moving south, Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. You know, there was a very rich tradition of Davy Crockett stories and Daniel Boone stories. One of the ones of Daniel Boone was that he had to move because he saw over that hill, he saw a little fire coming up from a log cabin, and he said, "It's getting too crowded." So Davy Crockett killed him a bear when he was only 3. You believe that, don't you? You don't? Well, it's a good story, and we don't want to let the facts get in the way of a good story. So there's a lot of stories about Davy Crockett and how he fought bears, he made friends with bears, he tamed them, he traveled all over. One time, there was a big comet heading towards the Earth. Yeah, this is stretching it a bit. And Davy Crockett, they called for him because he was the only man who could do this. And he got the comet by the tail and he swung it out of the way. Phew. He went to Congress, you know, and he introduced himself and he bragged. He had a friend who smoked a pipe, a bear. He rode on an alligator. And there are many, many stories of Davy Crockett and all the kinds of things he did, a whole series on television. On this cartoon, he was a closet animal liberationist. Can you see? That raccoon still alive. Yeah. Shh, don't tell. If we move north a bit, we hit Paul Bunyan. I was a bit enchanted with these stories in the 1940s when I was a kid. It was a bit of a disappointment to find that Paul Bunyan was largely a figment of an advertiser's imagination in the second decade of this century. Boo! It's a good story. Like Joe Magarac, he was so big, he stood above the trees, and when he chopped a tree, he could chop 50 trees at a time. This was pre-ecology, guys. The forests are not our friends. They get in the way. You can get lost in the forest. The forest is where the witches have their houses. Forests are a problem. Forests are where wild things are. Nowadays, forests are, we want to keep our forests around, preserve our forests. And what I'm really commenting on is how in mythology and legend, whole worldviews can change. But back then, he was a hero for how well he was able to clear large parts of the Northwest, starting in Maine and moving in to Ohio and Michigan. And he had a blue ox whose name was Babe. And they were giants. Do you notice that the trees kept getting smaller? This is like that guy who said my nose was so big, you know. They would tell these stories and they would magnify the stories and they would magnify them again. The way stories got told and distorted is a game that you used to play when you were kids. There was a game called telephone. There would be 9 kids playing parlor games. Tell kids today parlor games, they'd laugh at you. Is that like, you know? And one of the games is that you tell him something, and he whispers it to her, and she whispers it to him. And it's kind of fun to see what comes out at the end. There was a time, I wasn't there, so I just heard tell, that a monk in the 13th century went down to read in the scriptorium, and he didn't come back. So they sent another monk down. And they said, Brother Jonathan, what's happening? Because he was sitting there, Brother Jonathan, with tears in his eyes. And Brother Jonathan said, the word is celebrate, not celibate. So stories got exaggerated. One time there was a log jam because of all the kinks in the rivers, because rivers naturally go this way in many cases. It was important to straighten it out. Paul Bunyan hitched Blue Ox to the river and straightened out the river. What, you don't believe that? Yeah, I don't know, maybe it's true. I'm going to tell a story that's like that, another song, called The Logger Lover. I went down one evening, 'twas in a small cafe. A 40-year-old waitress to me these words did say, I see that you are a logger, and not just a common bum, 'cause nobody but a logger stirs his coffee with his thumb. My lover was a logger, there ain't none like him today. If you poured whiskey on it, he would eat a bale of hay. And my lover came to see me. 'Twas on a wintry day. They've been having times like this. He held me in a fond embrace that broke 3 vertebrae. And he kissed me when we parted so hard it broke my jaw. I could not speak to tell him he forgot his mackinaw, that's his jacket. I saw my lover leaving, sauntering through the snow, going gaily homeward at 48 below. The weather, it tried to freeze him. It tried its level best at 100 degrees below zero. He buttoned up his vest. Well, it froze clear down to China. It froze to the stars above. At 1,000 degrees below zero, it froze my logger love. And though they tried to thaw him, alas, it would not stir. So they made axe plates from him to chop the Douglas fir. And that's how I lost my lover. And to this cafe I come, and here I wait until someone like you stirs his coffee with his thumb. So there were these tall stories, and this is what your grandpa and grandmother heard, because they couldn't afford to go to the movie. They didn't even have movies. They couldn't afford to go to the theater, to the vaudeville. And they didn't even have a lot of those because it was a long distance. So they told stories. They told stories about people who would start, like Paul Bunyan, in one place and moved farther east. Keelboatmen were another group of people. And they would pole their way down the Mississippi. Oftentimes, by the way, they left the boat and the cargo and they walked back because it was too hard to go back up the river. It was easier to build a new boat. And they bragged and they fought, and Mike Fink was another one of them. Another character, as we hit Kansas, is an old sailor was noticing how hard it was to get the oxen to pull the wagons. He said, hey, we used to get whole ships going by sail. And he proposed a prairie schooner. And it worked a little bit. It could be said that this is not even a real story, but it worked a little bit, or the idea at least was appealing. And so Windwagon Smith has a whole series of stories about him. And so we have this area. We are right here. Are you aware that you live a few miles from the Chisholm Trail? So we get to be on this map. That makes us part of history.
Route 35. Route 35.
Route 35.
No, it would be
Interstate.
east-west.
No, it goes,
You don't see people driving cattle down.
well, I know, but it follows Route 35.
That's right.
Route 35 follows.
Another character who you probably have heard of is Pecos Bill. Pecos Bill was the meanest, orneriest guy who invented most of what we call cattle handling today. They didn't know how to do lariats until Pecos Bill invented them. They didn't know how to round up cattle until Pecos Bill filled it out. A lot of stories about Pecos Bill. He was bigger than life, like Joe Magarac, like Paul Bunyan. He was so tough, and there's the storyteller telling the story. It was so big. He was so mean. He was so tough that he became part of culture. He fell out of the I can push this. Does this work? Yeah, it works. It should work. There, it works. It has to lean up. Okay. He felt his family was heading west, and he fell out because they had 17 kids. He fell out, and he got raised by the coyotes. He thought he was a coyote. He lost his clothes because you grow up, you grow out of them. So he ran around naked, and he sang, and he believed he was a coyote. And one day, he was running around like a coyote, and this man came along on a horse and said, "You're not a coyote. You're a man." And the guy said, "Of course I'm a coyote," Pecos Bill said. "Ain't I got fleas?" He says, "No, you're a man. You're just naked." He says, I'm a coyote." He says, "Go look at yourself in the mirror." And he looked at the man, and he looked in the mirror, and he said, "I am still a coyote." He says, "You ain't got no tail." "Yeah, I do. Look at yourself in the mirror." And he slowly he got the idea. He's not a coyote. This was very disappointing. But he got with it, and he got with the program, and he became a rough, tough man. A lot of stories about Pecos Bill. Like one, sometimes he used a rattlesnake, but sometimes he had to use an actual piece of rope. And once there was a tornado coming, we have some of those things in this area, and he figured one way to handle a tornado is to lasso it, get on it, and treat it like a bucking bronco. And he did. He rode that tornado. He rode it all over. As a matter of fact, that's what dug, that tornado is what dug the Grand Canyon. It's true, sort of. They made a postage stamp of him. He was a character. One time, he was looking for trouble. He had found a rattlesnake. He gave it one bite free. But then he wrestled it down to the ground, and he used that as his lasso. And a mountain lion that was looking for trouble jumped on him. Well, that was just, kind of fun for him. And he wrestled it to the ground, and he made it his own personal horse before he found Widowmaker. Widowmaker was the horse he found later that nobody else could ride. But of course he did. There's Widowmaker. And he became part of Texas legend. Now, you guys live here in Texas. And you can tell stories and read stories, and I give you permission to elaborate the stories. Make them up as you go along, because that's what people have always done. I'm going to finish with another character moving a little bit back into West Virginia. John Henry was a steel driving man. And what he did was something that we are dealing with today, which is man versus machine. They're trying to automate you out of your job. Back then, they're trying to mechanize you out of your job. So I'll tell you a little story about John Henry. John Henry was a little baby sitting on his daddy's knee. He said the Big Bend Tunnel on the sea. No, oops, sorry. I'm going to start again. Okay. John Henry was a little baby sitting on his daddy's knee. Well, he picked up a hammer and a little piece of steel. Said, hammer's gonna be the death of me, Lord God. Hammer's gonna be the death of me. John Henry was a little baby sitting on his mama's knee. Said the Big Bend Tunnel on the C&O Road is gonna be the death of me, Lord God. Gonna be the death of me. Well, the captain said to John Henry, I'm gonna bring me a steam drill round. I'm gonna take that steam drill out on the job. I'm gonna whop that steel on down, Lord God. Gonna whop that steel on John. John Henry said to his captain, man ain't nothing but a man, but before I'll let that steam drill beat me down, I'll die with a hammer in my hand, Lord God. I'll die with a hammer in my hand. So they had a contest. Steam drill on one side, John Henry hammering with a shaker on the other. John Henry called to his shaker, shaker, why don't you sing? 'Cause I'm swinging 40 pounds from my hips on down. Just listen to that cold steel ring, Lord God. Listen to that cold steel ring. Captain called to John Henry, I do believe this mountain's sinking in. John Henry called out to his captain, no man, that's just my hammer sucking wind, Lord God. Just my hammer sucking wind. John Henry called to his shaker, well, shaker, you better pray, 'cause if and I miss this 6-foot piece of steel, tomorrow be your burying day, Lord God. Tomorrow be your burying day. John Henry called to his captain, looky yonder what I see. Your hole's done choked, your drill's done broke. You can't drive steel like me, Lord God. You can't drive steel like me. Oh, the man that invented the steam drill, he thought he was mighty fine. But John Henry, he made 16 feet. That steam drill made only 9, Lord God. Steam drill made only 9. John Henry was hammering on the mountain. His hammer was striking fire. He hammered so hard, he broke his poor heart. He laid down his hammer and he died, Lord God. He laid down his hammer and he died. They carried John Henry to the burying ground. They laid him in the sand. And every locomotive comes a-roaring by, says, there lies a steel-driving man, Lord God. There lies a steel-driving man. There lies a steel-driving man, Lord God. There lies a steel-driving man. I hope I've warmed you up, and some of you might know some questions or some anecdotes or some tall stories that are some of your favorites. Do you remember some of them? Or have you ever told any? Or read any that you find that I overlooked?
Calaveras County.
What?
Calaveras County.
The Jumping Frog of Calaveras County.
Yeah.
That's California. That's a good story.
Yeah.
That's Mark Twain's story. And Mark Twain is, he was at the edge of this. He was at the kind of made up some of these stories. And that period of time would spin out pretty good stories. Any others for now?
Erie Canal.
The Erie Canal back east has a good song to it. And it was quite a job to build it through the countryside. We forget how hard it was to make your way through the countryside. And so the people who sang that song,
16 miles on the Erie
What?
Canal. 16 miles on the Erie Canal.
That's right. That's right, 16 miles. Well, I had
As a kindergarten teacher, I think back now of the little poem for George Washington and all the other little poems we taught them that now really were untruths.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. A thing that goes with that has made tall stories difficult is that we polished the truth a great deal. And for example, it never occurred to me, it never entered my mind that the President of the United States might engage in hanky-panky. And starting in the 1960s, histories came out, not just about Jack Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe, but about Eisenhower and about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And if you start looking with modern history methods, many of the presidents, well, I never. I didn't even think about such things. Hollywood was very protective of its own. It never occurred to me that men like Tab Hunter might not be real men. We have been living in an era of profound demythification. And thank you for mentioning that, you know, we used to teach them like that happened. And I believed it, too. I mean, I didn't completely believe about my parents. I mean, well, my father maybe, but my mother never. This is that edge of non-official stuff that I'm asking you to re-encounter and remember. Because kids today will hardly remember any of these stories, and this is a part of history too. Any other anecdotes of so small, so tall, so hot?
I can't remember her name, but there's a song, I had a daughter 10 feet tall. She slept in the kitchen with her feet in the hall.
I had a daughter 10 feet tall.
Rubenstein Hogenbinder.
Yes.
Donna was her name.
There's a lot of children's songs that are fun because they are outrageous. In San Francisco, there lived a whale. She ate pork chops by the bale, by the truckload, by the wagon train, by the ton, by the schooner. She's a friendly whale, but when she smiles, you can see her teeth for miles and miles, and her spare ribs, and her tonsils, and things too fierce to mention. Oh, I went up in a balloon so big, the people on the earth, they looked like a pig, like a mouse, like a katydid, like flies and like fleases. But the balloon turned around with its bottom side higher. It fell on the wife of a country squire. She made a noise like a steam whistle, like a calliope, like squish. What can you do in a case like that? What can you do but stomp on your hat or your grandmother or your toothpaste or anything else that's helpless? Kids like this stuff. Yes?
Was the name of that girl Catalina, Madalena, Ruth Steiner, Walker?
Ah, yes.
Bogan was her name, I
Yes.
think.
Yeah.
When I was your age, we didn't have these things. And you know, it's wonderful. Google is so... I can say something like this. Look up John Henry and read some stories about him. Google it.
Right.
You couldn't talk that way 10 years ago. So it's changing. But kids love to imagine. And they love to imagine these stories, and they love to imagine gigantic people. And what is it like to do this? They like these stories. They like to break free of the constraints of reality. Reality, I'm a psychiatrist, okay? Which is really my cover. Because I am really encouraging people to play and to imagine and to enrich yourself. It loosens you up. It will lighten your eyes. It will twinkle your eyes. Your grandkids will love you all the more. Because somehow in the 20th century, you know, the olden days, people thought that if you had dignity and you never broke set and you never broke character, that that was the way to do it. But I preach role variability. Sometimes you can be straight and sometimes you're real silly, and your grandkids love that. Your kids like that too. And it also makes your life a lot funner. Yes?
It's amazing how much fairy tales and tall tales teach us about life, in a sense, because you're talking about the way that it shows the change in cultures.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, there are lots of things that you want to teach a child that can be shown through fairy tales, such as Hansel and Gretel, Don't Leave Home, those kinds of things. And I have a book at home called Fairy Tales for Midlife.
For midlife, fairy tales for midlife. Can you hear her?
Yeah. And it really is interesting because it's fairy tales that I remember from my childhood, but they really do speak to what happens to couples in midlife that you certainly don't think about as a child, but maybe the parents telling the tales were recognizing that at the time. I didn't, but I just think it's interesting.
I would like to see that book. I would like to just look through it. Then I can get it from the library. The name for that, by the way, for taking a story and extracting some wisdom from it, is called hermeneutics, a fancy word for the art of interpretation. Everybody interprets, but to do it artfully and consciously is an interesting thing. And I'd be intrigued with seeing how some fairy tales can be interpreted so that you can say, you know, there's a lesson there somewhere. But then again, you can do that with anything, with a little skill. Other comments? Or yes?
Did you ever try to explain the party line on the telephone to your grandchildren?
A party line?
About one ring and two rings, and when you were supposed to answer it and when you weren't?
You were too rich to have parties.
I never had one. That's fun. That's a fun thing about being here in Texas, is that there is a cultural spectrum from city kids to country kids. And there's a lot of people who really lived country. A fair number had real outhouses. Anybody here? You had? Really?
Oh, yeah. Till I was 11 or something.
Till you were 11. And this was in Kansas City? Colorado. Because in Kansas City, in Oklahoma, the guy was singing. I went to the World's Fair in that planet, and there's a part of the song that says, you can go to the bathroom and not get your feet wet. Everything's up to date in Kansas City. They've gone about as far as they can go. I love that.
What show is that from?
That's Oklahoma. They've gone about as far as they can go. Sometimes I think you've all felt this, that, well, I can't imagine them going any further than that, and then they go further.
Yeah.
And that, to get playful about it, is one way to get over that part of life that we're in. Because if you take it seriously, you're dead in the water. You know, it's appalling.
Talking about progress.
That's the word. Shh, shh, don't use dirty words. Progress. And that's what John Henry was. I like that because it's not man versus the machine and strength, but there are other things that even today are rapidly being automated and people are being put out of jobs. And how do you explain that? And you can tell the story of John Henry and say people have been struggling and holding off. How do we deal with the change of culture?
Today, John Henry would be admitting he was gay and going to play in the NFL.
John Henry admitting he was gay and going to play in the NFL. Well, that's how stories get elaborated and twisted and made interesting. And what I want to encourage you to do is read a few stories to your kids and grandchildren and then tell about your time in life. Kids love this. They love who you are is archetypal. I'm being a little bit Meredith Mitchell here. No, he talks about Jungian. And what I'm saying is that sometimes I forget how magical I am to my grandchildren and how magical you are to your grandchildren. And if you tell a story and let them see you, it's kind of like you become more alive. Yes?
Well, I've been doing this over the past 6 years in a class through like a college course on writing your life and time. So I'm writing some stories about grandparents and myself, because my grandchildren, you know, can't believe I went to a one-room school or had an outhouse. But what I did decide one day, I've written a story, it's called Radio Days.
Can you hear her?
Yes. Radio Days, because my grandchildren, I mean, there's radio, but now they have this and they have everything. So this is on the programs I used to listen to when I would come home from school. Well, to help my memory, I had to go into the internet and did radio shows from the 1940s. It's wonderful. The website is awesome. So I picked about 5 programs that I would listen to. But the one I'm going to tell you about is one of my favorites was the Lone Ranger. In Tonto. But you know, there's another name for Tonto if you go into Wikipedia or whatever it is. But this is a true story. Back in South Dakota, when I went in and I found this Lone Ranger's name was Brace Beamer.
Come stand over here. You know, no, I like that. You know, this is great.
No, really.
But I want everybody to hear.
Okay, the name of the Lone Ranger that I realized, I knew his name was Brace Beamer, but I again had to go into the website and I had a bio on him. And the story is he played the Lone Ranger for about 14 years, and he could only do that. Now, the one thing he could do Wild West shows. Okay, so back in South Dakota, my parents and I went to town, and we knew that the Lone Ranger was going to have a Wild West show in town. This was Yankton, South Dakota.
You mean he could appear?
He could appear
in
with
costume.
his horse and his silver. Okay. So we had gone into town early. This was in the evening, and we had gone to the Rexall drugstore, and the back there was we had got ice cream and sat in the back. And if you listened to the Lone Ranger, you knew what his voice sounded like, right? Yeah. You knew he had this deep voice. So I was back there with my family, I don't know, and all of a sudden I heard this deep voice. And I turned to my parents and I said, you know, that sounds like the Lone Ranger. Well, they said, oh, yeah, no, it can't be. So they said, well, you know, go up there. I'm surprised I was brave enough to go up. And there's this real tall, 6'4" man with a sport coat on, had come in, and I went up to him and I said, are you the Lone Ranger? He said, yes, I am. Said a tall tale. And I said, can I have your autograph? And he had a little piece of paper and he wrote his name, you know, to Karen from Brace Beamer. Well, that night we went to the show, and of course, here we were, he came on the stage with a hi-ho silver and that. Well, I end my little story and then saying, I am one of the people that got to see the Lone Ranger without his mask. So that was one of my stories that I read.
Well, we'll finish up by segueing that people tell stories. And I hope this will motivate you to tell your own stories to your kids, to each other, to own that you have a story to tell. Because people don't say, you know, who am I? I just have one darn thing after another. You have stories. I'll be talking about the kings of Africa next week at the Social Center.
Rooms 2 and 3. Rooms 1 and 2.
1 and 2. I said what number of people we have. They said you need 1 and 2. Huh?
The activity.
The activity center.
Well, the activity center.
Across the street.
Across the street.
Across the street.
What did I call it?
You said social.
You said social center.
God.
People change the stories sometimes accidentally. So that's another moral of the story. I hope this has got you thinking about your stories, the stories you tell, reclaiming the stories that you like, the heroes that you like. And thank you. We'll see you next week and talk about all this is happening all over Africa right now. People are telling stories. Thank you.